Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with Food and Water Watch. And I think of Food and Water Watch as really encompassing a lot of what we do at Democracy Now!, looking at sustainable systems, how to ensure that we have a sustainable planet. You know, I go back to my years at a bakery in Bar Harbor, Maine, the Sunflower Bakery, Sunflour. At the time, we made thousands of loaves of bread a week, and granola and peanut butter cookies and sunflower seed cookies. The coup I always thought would be to get our organic, macrobiotic loaves of bread into the public schools of Bar Harbor. How important it was for the kids to eat healthy food. But we couldn't compete with Wonder Bread, right? They could last, those loaves of bread could last for up to 2 years on the shelf. Ours may be 4 days before it started to mold because it was alive, because it was organic, because it was healthy. Moving from that to talking about how the whole planet operates and how we can ensure that there was an equitable distribution of food, and in this time of the pandemic, of health care, ensuring that people have access to the same kind of life-saving medicines and lifestyle that is so important for people to make it on the planet today. I'm just so honored to be with all of you, and I can't think of a more important time. I'm speaking to you on the day of this battle royale in Congress, where it's the progressives who are talking about how we ensure sustainability and build toward that in the future, and giving voice to those who are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. You know, one of the things we did this week is we went to Milan, Italy, to bring you the voices of the youth climate activists. I wanted to go to Vanessa Nakate. She's a young climate activist from Uganda. This is what she had to say.
Historically, Africa is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, and yet Africans are already suffering some of the most brutal impacts fueled by the climate crisis. Rapidly intensifying hurricanes, devastating floods, and withering droughts. Many Africans are losing their lives, while countless more have lost their livelihoods.
So that's Vanessa Nakate from Uganda, and how important it is to hear voices from the continent, from Africa. And then there's now 18-year-old Greta Thunberg, who is a young Swedish activist that people do know around the globe, who once again had a critical message for her elders.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises.
Yes, that's Greta Thunberg, and that message about the blah, blah, blah certainly is not what Food and Water Watch represents. It's not about the blah, blah. It's about taking action on the ground, or as Food and Water Watch says, fighting like you live here. Yes, and looking at the planet as the place where we live, fighting for everyone and the flora and the fauna on the whole planet. So because of Democracy Now!, and I think that's what it's so important to celebrate today, 25 years of a grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour, the voices of Greta, the voices of Vanessa, and so many others can resound in Washington, even in the midst of this battle where you have the majority, for example, of the Democrats in Congress all stand as one when it comes to changing the framework and the social safety net and the sustainable practices for this country. But they're standing against just a few other Democrats. For example, Joe Manchin, is it any surprise the senator from West Virginia is the largest recipient of oil, gas, coal aid from lobbyists in the entire Senate? And so he stands against his colleagues. It's young people that are challenging all of that and are giving the lie, that are changing the face of this planet. Democracy Now! Giving voice to really the silenced majority. And I'm not just talking about a media that's been taken from us that is Fox. You have MSNBC, you have CNN. These are networks that are brought to you by the corporations. So when there's a discussion of war, you have the chaos of the end of the war in Afghanistan that they will talk about. But when it comes to the 20 years of war, I mean, they're brought to you by the weapons manufacturers, by the Boeings, by the Raytheons, by the McDonnell Douglases. We need an independent media when we cover war and peace. When we cover the climate catastrophe, the emergency, the climate crisis, we're not brought to you by the oil, gas, coal companies like Manchin. We're brought to you by listeners and viewers and readers. And that's why it's so important to have independent media. When we cover inequality, we're not brought to you by the financial institutions. We're not brought to you by the banks. Again, brought to you by the people all over this planet who are deeply committed to the idea that information is power. And we have to keep that information flow going. Which is why, back a few years ago, we went to Standing Rock in North Dakota. That was the time of the Trump-Clinton race. You will remember it well, right? That year, 2016. And that year, something else was happening. You had this unprecedented gathering. It began April 1st, 2016, with LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who was the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Reservation and the Standing Rock Nation, the tribe. LaDonna Brave Bull Allard is no longer with us. She died this year of brain cancer. But her legacy continues, and of course the legacy of the standoff at Standing Rock. Through that presidential election year, starting April 1st, she invited people to her property, beautiful along the Cannonball River. And she said, if you want to fight the Dakota Access Pipeline, come. She thought maybe a few dozen people would come. Dozens came, then hundreds, then thousands. They set up teepees, they set up tents, and they were there to take on energy transfer partners. It was Native Americans from Latin America, the United States, the First Nations of Canada, and so many non-Native allies. It was so large, though they set up the Sacred Stone Camp there, then the Red Warrior Camp, and it just kept growing. It was monumental. We came there Labor Day weekend as the election was gaining steam. You know, in those presidential election debates, not one journalist, moderator, asked a question, not even about Standing Rock, but about the climate crisis. And that's why we knew it was absolutely critical to show what was happening on the ground. And so our Democracy Now! Team went there. Labor Day weekend it was, and we started to cover the protests. They were astounding. You had girls and women and boys. They were marching along rural roads, and they were standing off against the rural sheriff's department that were fully militarized. I mean, they had MRAPs, they had drones, they had tanks. And they weren't just standing up for the Standing Rock Reservation. They were standing up for everyone. They didn't call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors. The Dakota Access Pipeline would go under the Missouri River, the longest river in the United States, and it would expose 17 million people or so downstream. And people thought at the time that that was not worth the risk, and continue to think that if there were oil leaks. And so they were fighting this. And they, hundreds then thousands, they would march. This was hardly getting covered. And then on September 3rd, 2016, we heard about a group of Native Americans who were going to what they considered their sacred ground, a burial ground, and they were going to plant tribal flags. So we followed them, our team, and we're filming. But when they got there, they were horrified because there were bulldozers, dapple bulldozers, and they were destroying the sacred ground. A judge was going to rule a few days later, but they were making the point moot by destroying the property before he ruled. And so when the people got there and saw that this area was being excavated, they stood in front of the bulldozers, girls and women, men, boys, incredibly brave. Incredibly brave. These are earth-crushing machines. But they stood there, and the bulldozers pulled back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They started to pull back. And as they pulled back, you then had the Dakota Access Pipeline security guards unleashing dogs on the protesters, on the Native Americans. Dogs. We filmed one dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. They were biting the Native Americans. This was a horrific sight, but the people never stopped, and they just kept on marching ahead. Ultimately, they would intimidate the guards enough where the guards pulled back. They were forced to pull their dogs back. And they got into their pickup trucks and their Jeeps, and the bulldozers pulled back, and the people marched forward. They just kept marching. And that was the scene that day. And it was amazing to see the bravery of the people. It was amazing to see this standoff that it looked like, at that moment, had won. We had the film video footage. We posted it online. And, you know, sometimes I'm invited into CNN, MSNBC, to speak about various issues. And now they took the video footage. But I would always say to the host, why don't you cover the climate emergency more? And they would say, oh, you know, the corporate executives, they say people's eyes roll when you start talking about climate change. When we posted this online, there were more than 14 million views in 24 hours. Any of the network corporate executives would drool to have that level of response. People do care. Again, those who care about war and peace, who care about inequality, who care about the climate emergency are not a fringe minority, not a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. We came back to New York, and we're covering the issue from there and all that had taken place. And on the day before the judge ruled on the sacred ground issue, the governor at the time, North Dakota Governor Dalrymple, called out the National Guard. It did not look promising for the Native Americans. Oh, and the authorities quietly issued an arrest warrant for me I didn't know this at the time. On Friday, I headed up to Canada, to the Toronto International Film Festival with Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. I mean, we weren't fleeing. We were going to a film festival. I didn't know there was an arrest warrant that had been issued. And when I was speaking at University of Toronto the next day, I get a text on my phone that says, "You're under arrest." Like, there's an arrest warrant for you. I didn't know if some kid had hacked my phone and they were just fooling with me as I was giving this speech. But then I saw it was a North Dakota number. This probably was real, and I didn't know what to do, and so I just quietly said, I didn't want to reveal what I had learned because I thought maybe I wouldn't be able to get over the border if I did. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? I raced to the airport and got back over the border. I knew that if you are under arrest and there's an arrest warrant, if you have dealings with the border guards, with the FBI, or if you have dealings with the police, that's when you could be taken. But if I could get there before the arrest warrant were put in the system, came back to the U.S., and it was clear this was true. I mean, the authorities wanted to put out a message to all journalists: do not come to North Dakota, which is why it's critical that media be there, especially for young journalists who don't have the kind of backing of large institutions. I wanted to let them know that it was critical to take on the bullies. Whether we're talking about in Washington, whether we're talking about the large corporations around the world who, well, try to operate unfettered unless there is a free press and activism on the ground that takes them on. So we flew back to North Dakota, and as we landed, we heard they were dropping the charges, but then bringing more serious charges against me. Felony riot? What, like I'm a one-woman riot? But it's only because of the media covering this issue. We had a few days to cover the protests before I would be arraigned. We did the broadcast from across the street from the prison and the courthouse. We brought on the chair at the time of the Standing Rock Sioux, Chairman Dave Archambault, and asked if he had ever been arrested. He said yes, he'd been put in an orange jumpsuit because he engaged in civil disobedience. We interviewed We interviewed the doctor, the pediatrician of the reservation, and she, too, was one of the first because she was protesting to protect the lives of the children. And she, too, had been strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit, and jailed. And as we broadcast this and the show ended, more and more attention came. It was the homepage of BBC and Al Jazeera, and the New York Times was covering this. Even Vogue magazine, believe it or not. And right before I was going to be arraigned, many Native Americans came to show solidarity. The judge would not sign off on the charges because the media spotlight was being shown in the right direction. In fact, many Native Americans who were going to court that day on various charges had their charges dropped. That's a media shining a spotlight in the right direction, showing what's happening on the ground. It's the kind of reality TV that we all must support, the reality of everyday people's lives on the ground. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Native Americans would be arrested over those months. And ultimately, the Dakota Access Pipeline would be built, although President Obama, because of the massive protests, was forced to pull back and say they would not grant the permit for the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when he saw the video of the dogs biting the Native Americans, it wasn't lost on the first African-American president, going back to the civil rights era, the dogs in the South. But when President Trump came into office, one of the first things he did was greenlight the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Ultimately, Biden would turn that Keystone XL green lighting around, but has still continued with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And then you have the brave people, the indigenous people who've been leading the fight against Enbridge Line 3 that now says that the oil will be flowing this week. But whether people win or lose in a particular battle, what counts is they are out there on the ground, and each battle builds to the next one. I think Food and Water Watch understands what that's all about, and we need a media that is not captive of the corporations, but is there on the ground showing those battles every single day. And that's why it's such an honor to be with you here today. These are critical times. Activism is clearly where it's at. I mean, under President Trump, clearly there was a wall, right? He represented a wall. That was the image, the metaphor that is not just a metaphor. And that wall has turned into a door under the Biden administration, but I'm not saying that door is open. Under the Biden-Harris administration, it is a door, and whether it is kicked open or slammed shut depends not on those behind the door trying to keep it closed, but on everyone else, the vast majority of people. It is so critical that voices be heard, that we have a media that spans the globe, that everyone sits around like a kitchen table and debates and discusses the critical issues of the day, war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. I'll end going back to World War II, to the White Rose Collective, this remarkable young brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl. Hans was a medical student at University of Munich Medical School, and Sophie was an undergraduate. And they weren't Jewish, but they certainly understood the horror of the Nazis, and they wanted to get word out. And so with their professor and other workers and students, they distributed pamphlets everywhere. If they would be dropped from atriums at school to marketplaces to alleyways, like 6 pamphlets in all. And one of those pamphlets said, "We will not be silent." Hans and Sophie Scholl, their professor, and others were arrested. They would be charged, tried, and ultimately beheaded by the Nazis. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!